The crown flies, the crown flies. Now you are not the king of the werewolves. Be sure to subscribe to my channel. This happened when I was young, so to be kind we'll say it was a little while ago. I grew up in a small, isolated village in Asia. Flimsy wooden houses with roofs made from rusting metal and other scrap materials lined the slush we called streets. Children ran through the filth barefooted, ignoring the mounting piles of trash, and people lived in an uncomfortable closeness where there was little privacy. Desperate merchants occupied any remaining available space, trying to sell their knockoff wares and shouting shamelessly at any unfortunate who happened past. For us kids, there was no TV or video games, and sometimes my family, like many others, struggled for basic necessities such as food or clean water. However, despite these conditions and the little we had, I remember my childhood fondly, as my family was a loving, close-knit bunch. We were 5 brothers and 2 sisters with a great number of cousins, and our parents always worked hard to provide for us. There was only one time in my childhood when I felt truly afraid, and that was when my older cousin Morley became sick with an illness more terrifying and unexplainable than anything I had ever seen. It had been the middle of summer, I was 6 years old, the sweltering heat was enough to melt away any optimism, and the air hung thick with humidity. That was when the visitor from the Western world arrived in our tiny village. He was a short English man. His round face was a flush red from the weather, with beads of perspiration adorning his brow as he stumbled into our village wearing a small hat and explorer clothing. His skinny pale legs reflected back the sun brilliantly, and we made jokes at his expense for it, but we also found ourselves captivated by the stories he would tell. We were also a little impressed he could speak the language fairly fluently. Our favorite story was the one about the wolf man. A man was bitten by a wolf to become a monstrous creature under the full moon of the night, unable to control his beast instincts to kill and devour anyone he came across. It was the tale we requested to hear more than once, and with each telling he would add new details to alight our imaginations. Our young minds were captivated, listening to his every word with anticipation. In fact, the first English word I learned because of him was werewolf. We would even play werewolf amongst ourselves when we could. One of us would chase while the others ran. If you were caught, you were now a werewolf too. The game was fun to us until one day a group of us had run the wrong way down an alley and found ourselves face to face with a pack of feral dogs. Now feral dogs were, and still are, an issue that is faced by my home village. The dogs multiply and became aggressive towards people very easily, so it was not uncommon to run into a bad dog or to be chased by one. This is what happened on that day. Upon being disturbed, the dogs growled and barked viciously. My sisters ran, and this caused the dogs to chase. Soon we were all running for our lives from the animals, and at some point during the confusion, Morley had been bitten by a dog. The bite was not so bad, hardly having broken the skin, and there was almost no blood. Collectively we decided not to tell our parents. We didn't want to get into trouble, and instead joked about how Morley was now a wolf man, just like the stories. However, in the days after he was bitten, Morley really did begin to behave strangely. He became restless, unable to sit still. He was very agitated and would move about constantly. His movements were not with any purpose or direction, but he started to tell us that he was changing, that he could feel the change. This, of course, scared us. In hushed tones, we discussed what we were going to do now that he was a werewolf. In the Englishman's stories, the beast had been put down with silver, but we had none. Days passed as he began to change more. He refused food and water, even going as far as to spit it back up violently. Drool dribbled from the corner of his mouth and down his chin. We reasoned that he was now only hungry for flesh and thirsty for blood. It was at this point that we finally confessed to our parents what had happened, though I am certain they already knew something was wrong before that. We had hoped they would know what to do, but after telling them none of us were allowed to see Morley. We were told this was because his transformation was nearly complete. That he had become aggressive and dangerous. Often standing on all fours, he would growl and snap at anyone who came near. Thick saliva ran down his chin in an animalistic fashion, and by the end of the week he seemed to us to truly be an animal. My brothers, sisters and I were all afraid of him. We thought he was sure to change into a wolf any day, and none of them wanted to see him anymore, but I was curious. Curiosity burned in me, and I wanted to know if the story was true, if he was really going to turn into a werewolf, so I begged my parents to see him. They looked nervous but eventually agreed to let me go if I took my older brother with me. My older brother agreed, and together we went to see Morley. The memory of seeing him that day is something I will never forget. He was laying in bed growling like an animal. A frothy white foam bubbled around his lips as he opened and shut his mouth with deep wet gurgles. His eyes rolled back into his head intermittently, but when they would focus on us he would growl louder and arch himself into a horrible, painful-looking positions. His mother stayed beside him, dabbing the moisture from his forehead and wiping away the drool dutifully. She cared, avoiding being bitten as she did, though, as he would occasionally snap his mouth shut with force like a snapping turtle. It was terrifying to see him in this way. Some part of me knew then that he was not becoming a werewolf, but I didn't know what was happening either, so I had no other way of explaining it. When I returned home to my parents, they gathered all of us together and explained that if ever any of us were bitten we needed to tell them right away. Morley died the following day, and it wasn't until years later that I found out what had happened. My cousin was not a werewolf. He was suffering from a viral disease that was eating away the grey matter in his brain. He had a lysavirus, a fatal disease transmitted through the saliva of the infected. It is a disease that is still active even in the modern world, and in advanced countries, a bite, scratch or lick from an infected animal is all it takes. The worst part of it is that symptoms can appear days, weeks or even years after infection, and once they do it's too late. There is no cure.